Hello, I'm Maya Parson here in Leuven, Belgium for the Human Nature Forum. I am here today with another episode of Talking Human Nature with my guest, Dr. Maria Kronfeldner of Central European University in Vienna. Welcome, Dr. Kronfeldner.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us today. You are the author of a book from MIT Press published in 2018 called What's Left of Human Nature. And you are professor of philosophy who has spent a great deal of time studying human nature. And I would like to know a bit about how you became interested in this topic and why it matters to you.
It's a long history, actually. I started as a graduate student. I was interested very much in creativity, understanding our own ways of being creative. And being creative means that you produce novelty. And then if you want to understand how novelty emerges in our minds, then you quickly discover nature produces novelty as well. And that brought me to biology and studying biology from a philosophical perspective. So I'm approaching the topic less from a philosophy of science perspective, like studying what the scientists tell us about being human. But my actual motivation in writing about human nature was to understand how that idea still makes room for us being free, for us being creative. And creative also means that we are becoming humans as we act. So it's not, human nature for me is not a given. And that's also what I'm arriving at the end of the book, to have a concept of human nature that is dialectic in the sense that it's a process that we do together. And in that sense, it's the first sense in which my account of human nature tries to use the idea in an emancipatory way, because it makes room for human freedom and still has an idea of human nature that we can use. And the other is that motivation that was behind is that talking about being human, and in particular human nature, also had a dark side that I noticed and that authors noticed, that is usually going with the label dehumanization. So when we use the concept of the human, and in particular the concept of human nature, we think that we are the human, so we humanize us and we dehumanize some others, strangers, refugees, poor people, managers, very rich people are often dehumanized as well. So those people whom we regard as others, and that we want to create a distance, and sometimes even if we want to have a justification for violence. So I was interested in othering, creativity, and in understanding also the dark side of how we act to each other. So it had that existential dimension of understanding our freedom, and it had that social dimension of understanding how we act to each other, and whether the concept of the human plays a role there. But then if you do philosophy, you have to go into all the details that the scientists provide and that the philosophical tradition provides. And there you discover quite some issues. And I call these issues in addition to the dehumanization challenge, I discussed two further challenges that are there for our understanding of being human and therefore human nature. And I called it the Darwinian challenge. It's not, other people have used it as well, but I really use it systematically then as a label, and the developmentalist challenge. The Darwinian challenge refers to the fact that evolutionary thinking says that everything changes, right? And if everything changes, there can't be a human nature that is a given. And that idea of a givenness relates on the one hand to something like innateness and biological inheritance, and on the other hand to an idea of that is traditionally called an essence, which is a very technical term, but it also has a mundane use sometimes, but it's more of a kind of a philosophical, technical term, I'd say. So, and then I thought I want to derive something, so I want to meet these challenges, and that gave rise to the book.
I'm fascinated by everything you've said, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how you reconcile for yourself this tension between human nature as this this notion that has done harm historically and in the contemporary world, and one that can provide us with this type of creative direction or even hope for humanity that you are describing.
So the hope comes from two directions, or maybe it's more. I have to think how I could align them now. But it first derives from that historicity that Darwin actually provides us with. And evolutionary thinking is a dynamic historical thinking. So it means that there is no security in the past, right? In the sense that there was no guarantee for being human. It is actually quite a luck that we're here, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of frightening in a way, and for 19th century people, it was frightening that Darwin's theory actually meant that we descend from which were considered as not moral enough and not fitting the kind of religious worldviews that were still very prevalent at that time. So, but it also means that whatever we observe now about us, for instance, the cruelty we show to each other, the nastiness, the atrocities that we get from the news almost every day, if that is how we behave to each other, then there's still hope that we can change. We can use the freedom we have in order to do better. And a Darwinian theory allows us to do that. And an essentialist theory of human nature, where human nature and the term nature refers to something fixed and given and unchangeable,
right?
Is not, if then what you observe about us is not what you like to see about us, only have otherworldly salvation or something like that, or at least this is one way of then still having hope. So I think the Darwinian challenge actually can be reconciled with a vision of being human that is optimistic and not just pessimistic, without being unrealistic about us. And so it's that historical picture, which is a dynamic picture, which is a dialectic picture. The facts and what we think should be can interact and via a looping, so to say, where the facts and the norms help each other changing things to a nicer, more adequate future of us interacting among each other and to the environment and to other animals. And the developmentalist challenge can be overcome by accepting that it's not the case that only biologically inherited resources, genetic factors, or the bodily constraints, that they are the only things that matter for us as organisms, as individuals, as intergenerational families, or as a society, or as a global humanity. It's and that is why I call my account interactive. So it's interactive in the sense that nature and nurture, nature and culture are interacting at all these levels. That's not controversial anymore within the philosophy of science community. The details of that interaction are still discussed, like on a rather technical level, let's say. But bringing the interactionist picture to the full flowering, I think was a task that I wanted to accomplish. And as part of that interactive account of human nature, where human nature and human culture interact at all levels that we can imagine, I defended against some of the philosophers who share my senses about the outdated essentialist notion of human nature. I defend the nature-culture divide. I say we still need a distinction between human nature and human culture. And I claim we still need that distinction, because otherwise we can't reconcile our understanding and our hopes as free creative beings with the interactionist picture. And the inspiration comes actually from the history of anthropology, where at the beginning of the 20th century, cultural anthropologists, when cultural anthropology kind of formed its own professional identity, Alfred Kroeber had a nice way of reconciling cultural anthropology with the knowledge we, by that time, the beginning of the 20th century, already had from the Darwinian New Worldview, let's say. And he kind of portrayed it nicely by saying, there is evolution, which is a change over time. And then there is cultural evolution. So another, not but biological evolution, the evolution of our bodies. There's culture. And the specific thing is the culture can take off like an airplane. It really can take off. Right? Where this is progressing slowly, culture is like a fast track takeoff mechanism that humans have available. And in a way that no other animal has it. So that taking off is a separation of nature and culture. So on the one hand, they are interacting all the time, right? The two developments, biological evolution and cultural evolution, are interacting all the time. Nonetheless, culture can take off. And that is what makes us so, one of the things that makes us very unique, right? It's not an isolated thing, because that we can have that freedom has a lot of cognitive underpinnings and social underpinnings, etc., etc. But it's a crucial thing that there's that freedom. And other philosophers of science seem not to regard that aspect of thinking about human nature so important. And because there was so much genetic determinism around in the second half of the 20th century, the motivation was more, oh, we have to show that they are nature and nurture interacting all the time to fight genetic determinism. And for me, that led to a situation where people get too interactionist and don't see that culture gives us that kind of freedom. So compared to some authors in the philosophical recent literature on human nature, I defend the nature-culture divide in order to have an emancipatory concept of human nature, but without falling back to genetic determinism, without falling back to outdated essentialism, and without giving room for dehumanization, which is another special side, so to say, which is why I followed up on another publication, a handbook on dehumanization, to give it more room. It is there in the book as well, and I can say more on that if you want.
Yeah, well, you've given us a tremendous amount of food for thought, and this is really wonderful for thinking about the concept. And I know we don't have a lot more time, but I do want to ask you before I let you go about the terminology that you use, because I know that at the end of What's Left of Human Nature, you question whether we should even still be using this term human nature. And given what you've just explained to us, I'm wondering if since that book was written, if you have been rethinking that, or whether you have a terminology that you prefer or that you are using in your current work or your more recent work. Where are we left if we are in fact questioning even the usage of the term, and what is out there for us alternatively?
Yeah, thank you. That's one of these things where I really still struggle with, because even though I conclude the book with saying, okay, now that we clarified, I hope clarified the picture a bit more, we should stop using the term, right? I've written almost 200 pages of a book, and then I say, don't talk about that anymore. But I mean, don't use the word whenever possible. And I just realized since I published the book how hard that is.
Mhm.
It is harder than I initially actually, I think, admitted to
Mhm.
get rid of the term. It's the term nature, as we use it in human nature or bonobo nature or a dog nature, is so entrenched in our thinking, and it's just so entrenched that that's probably the reason why it's so hard to get rid of. But that was at the same time the reason why I said, one of the reasons why I said we have to get rid of it, because otherwise we fall back to the outdated essentialist thinking about fixity, about black and white. You're either human or you're not allowing shades and kind of beings that are both at the same time or are at the border or not standardly the typical way of being human. So in order to make room for nuance, for shades, for historical hope, for diversity, and all these phenomena, the old essentialist way of thinking is a problem, and the word nature is just equated with the word essence so often that continuing using the word is a trouble, is a problem. But it's hard to get rid of it. I try. So when I'm not asked to talk about human nature, then I have to use it, right? Or I'm teaching a course on human nature. I mean, I shouldn't. But we are not yet there, right? It's the overall ontology we are using, not just in the West. It's in other ontologies, Chinese ontology, indigenous ontologies, et cetera, et cetera. It's there as well, very often, not everywhere. So it's quite some work to get rid of that bundle of ideas that were traditionally held together. And but I try. So I distinguish in the book between what's left is the way of life we have, which I call, we can call it a descriptive nature, just the way we are, where scientists like anthropologists just tell us how we are nowadays in the 21st century. It's different to how people have been 2,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 50,000 years ago, etc. So that is just describing how we are. It's our way of living, our form of life. So don't call it human nature. If we just want to talk about how we are, just say, this is our way of living. This is our form of life.
Yeah.
And if you want to talk about, as a geneticist, about biological inheritance and that there are genetic defects that make some individual human lives very difficult, then talk about the developmental resources we are inheriting via biological reproduction. We don't need to call the bundle of biologically inherited resources an explanatory nature, but that's what it does. It's something that is natural in the sense that it's biologically inherited, contrasted to culturally inherited stuff, developmental resources that you can use to flourish. So in that sense, there's the nature-culture contrast. And these resources explain the way we are as individuals, as a group. But we don't need to call that a human nature in the sense, because that then reminds us, oh, isn't that then fixed? Isn't that then given? You can't change it, and something more important than culture. And for me, they're equal. So by not calling it nature, by calling it biologically inherited developmental resources, culturally inherited developmental resources, environmental resources, they're all developmental resources interacting to cause our way of life, but no priority given to the biologically inherited ones, at least not at the developmental level. And then there's the classificatory bit of the old concept of human nature, because we used the concept of human nature for saying who counts as a human and who does not. So there were times in the history of humanity where those who are now counted as members of the species Homo sapiens were not counted as humans. They were excluded as humans. So the concept of the human is used for saying who counts and who does not count for moral reasons as well, whether you get moral standing, whether you get protection from violence, whether you get certain help, etc., etc. So that classification, whether you as an individual are classified into the group of being a human or out, one of us, being one of us, that is something that we do with the concept of human nature. It refers to groups and boundaries of groups. And we will always do that classification and making in groups and out groups, and use the concept of the human. But we can just say this is the group of humans or the species or humanity. So we don't need to use the term human nature if we want to classify people into different groups and into different species. We don't need to use the term human nature if we want to talk about our way of life. And we don't need to use the term human nature if we want to talk about the contrast between biologically inherited developmental resources and culturally inherited developmental resources. But these concepts are there. And historically, the term human nature was used for all three of these different things in the word that were bundled together previously as one concept of human nature. So I'm going post-essentialist, deleting the concept of essence. Pluralist, there are different things in the word that we could call a human nature in the classificatory, descriptive, or explanatory sense. And then I go revisionary and say we shouldn't use the word nature for these different things anymore, because if it's three different things in the world, why use one term, right? And in particular, if that term is reminding us of the old outdated way of thinking about human nature. But I know that it's hard to eliminate such a strong word. So that will be an eternal struggle to stay post-essentialist, so to say.
It's a task of the creativity and freedom that comes with our human nature, that we come up with new language and words for these notions.
As in many areas of life, we need the words changing with our thinking, and that takes time.
Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been fascinating, and I wish I could sign up for your class. I hope our viewers will check out your book that we've been discussing today, What's Left of Human Nature. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kronfeldner.